This is the true story of Elon Musk, the man who wanted to save humanity. Chapter 1. A Strange Child in South Africa. Pretoria, South Africa, 1971. The kind of city where the sun hits hard, the suburbs stretch wide, and the social rules are even wider. A place where fitting in wasn't just encouraged, it was practically enforced. And into this world, on June 28th, arrived a boy who would spend the next several decades making fitting in look absolutely impossible. His name was Elon Musk. His father, Elon Musk, was a South African engineer, successful, sharp, complicated, and by most accounts, not an easy man to live with. His mother, May, was a Canadian-born model and dietitian, beautiful and fiercely intelligent, the kind of woman who radiated capability even in difficult circumstances. Together, they made an unlikely pair, and their marriage was, to put it diplomatically, turbulent. The atmosphere in the Musk home was never quite calm. There was money, there was status, there was comfort, and underneath all of it, there was tension that a sensitive child could feel in the walls. Elon was a sensitive child. He was also, from almost the very beginning, deeply, profoundly strange. And we mean that as the highest possible compliment. By age 4, he had developed the habit of simply disappearing into his own head mid-conversation. He would go so far inside a thought that the world outside ceased to exist. People would be talking to him, calling his name, waving hands in front of his face. Nothing. He was gone. His parents were worried enough to have his hearing checked. The doctors found nothing wrong with his ears. What they found instead was a child whose internal processing was simply running at a speed and depth that regular conversation couldn't compete with. Books could compete. Books were, in fact, the one thing that could reliably hold Elon Musk's attention without having to fight for it. He read the way other children breathed, continuously, automatically, as if stopping might be dangerous. By age 9, he had finished every book in his local library, every single one. When the library ran out, he moved on to encyclopedias, reading them cover to cover the way you might read a novel, retaining information with a completeness that startled adults around him. His brother Kimball later recalled that Elon could recall facts from books he'd read years earlier with almost photographic precision, not showing off, just genuinely unable to forget things he'd found interesting. At 10, his parents divorced. Elon made a decision that puzzled everyone around him. He chose to go live with his father, Errol, rather than his mother. It's a decision he has since said he regrets. Elon Musk is a figure Elon has spoken about with a mixture of pain and careful restraint over the years. He was a terrible human being, Elon has said in interviews, declining to elaborate much further, which somehow makes it more rather than less striking. Whatever the details of those years with his father were, they left marks. The kind that don't show on the outside, but quietly shape everything. And then there was school. School was, for Elon Musk, a particular kind of misery. Not academically. Academically, he was in a class of his own, consuming curriculum at a pace that left teachers scrambling. The misery was social, and it was severe. Elon was small for his age, bookish, intense, and possessed of a conversational style that basically involved saying exactly what he thought with zero filtering. He had not yet discovered that this was a quality the world would eventually reward enormously. In a South African schoolyard in the early 1980s, it mostly just got him beaten up, and he was beaten up, regularly, badly. Once, a group of boys threw him down a flight of concrete steps and then kicked him until he lost consciousness. He was hospitalized. He came back to school, and it happened again. Not metaphorically, physically, repeatedly, painfully, for years. Here is what's remarkable about this. It didn't make him smaller. It didn't make him quieter or more cautious or more inclined to hide the parts of himself that made him a target. If anything, it seemed to calcify something in him, a refusal to be reshaped by other people's discomfort with who he was. He emerged from childhood with bruises and with a spine made of something close to titanium. What saved him, at 10 years old, was a computer, a Commodore VIC-20 to be precise. His parents bought it, somewhat reluctantly, and included a basic programming manual that was supposed to take about 6 months to work through. Elon finished it in 3 days. Within months, he had taught himself to code, and at 12 years old, he wrote a video game, a space-themed shooter he called Blaster, and sold it to a PC magazine for $500. $500. 12 years old. First sale. He would not stop selling things for the rest of his life. The game itself was not revolutionary. It was a competent, enthusiastic piece of work from a child who had taught himself the tools in a matter of months. But what it revealed was something more significant than the code, an ability to identify a goal, acquire whatever knowledge was necessary to reach it, and then execute, without waiting for permission, without waiting for the right moment, without waiting for someone to teach him the proper way. He simply decided to do it, figured out how, and did it. That pattern, decide, learn, build, launch, would define every significant thing Elon Musk ever did. He was 12 years old, sitting in a Pretoria suburb, selling video games to magazines, reading science fiction novels that described futures humanity hadn't built yet, and thinking, with a seriousness that would have seemed absurd in a child if it hadn't turned out to be completely sincere, about how to fix them. The world had no idea what was coming. Chapter 2. Running away from the world he knew. There is a moment in every great story where the protagonist has to leave, has to pack up whatever they have, which is usually not much, and walk away from the familiar toward something terrifying and unknown. For Elon Musk, that moment came in his late teens, and the thing he was walking away from wasn't just a country. It was a future that had been quietly decided for him without his consent. South Africa, in the late 1980s, had a mandatory military conscription program. Every young white South African man was expected to serve. This was not a negotiable suggestion. It was the law, enforced, expected, and socially normalized in the circles Elon moved in. You finished school, you served, you got on with your life. Elon Musk looked at this prospect and felt something between deep discomfort and outright refusal. He had nothing against service in principle. What he had was a specific, visceral objection to what the South African military was actually being used for, enforcing apartheid, propping up a system of racial oppression that he found morally indefensible. He was not willing to point a gun at people on behalf of a government whose fundamental premise he rejected. There was also a second, quieter reason to leave. South Africa, for all its sunshine and space, felt like a ceiling. A brilliant young man could build a decent life there. He could not, Elon suspected, build the kind of life he was beginning to imagine, one that involved rockets and electric cars and the future of human civilization. For that, he needed America. And to get to America, the easiest path ran through Canada, where his mother May had family and where Elon had been able to claim citizenship through her. So at 17, he left. Not dramatically, not with a grand farewell. He simply got on a plane with almost no money, landed in Canada, and began the unglamorous process of figuring out how to survive. His mother and siblings would follow eventually. His father stayed behind. The distance between Elon and Elon Musk, already significant emotionally, became geographic as well, and would only grow. Canada was cold, confusing, and almost completely devoid of anyone who knew or cared who Elon Musk was, which was, in a strange way, exactly what he needed. He worked whatever jobs were available, cleaning out a lumber mill's boiler room, which he described as one of the most unpleasant experiences of his life, shoveling grain and other agricultural work. These were not the kinds of jobs that appeared in the future biographies of tech billionaires, but they were real, and they were humbling, and they taught him something important about what he was and wasn't willing to do for money. He wasn't willing to do it for very long, was the answer. He made his way to Queen's University in Ontario, a respectable institution, a legitimate start. He was smart enough to get in, motivated enough to work, and restless enough to spend most of his mental energy on things that had nothing to do with his official coursework. He read constantly. He thought constantly. He began developing the habit, which would become almost legendary, of reasoning from first principles, stripping any problem down to its most basic physical or logical components, ignoring conventional assumptions, and rebuilding his understanding from the ground up. It was the way physicists thought, and Elon increasingly thought like a physicist, even when he was supposed to be thinking like an engineering student. At Queen's, he also discovered something surprising. He was good with people when he wanted to be. The socially isolated, repeatedly beaten boy from Pretoria had not, it turned out, become a recluse. He had become someone who simply had very high standards for conversation and very little patience for small talk, but who could be enormously engaging, funny, and magnetic when the topic was something he cared about. He made friends. He had his first serious relationships. He began to understand that the intensity which had made him a target in South Africa could, in the right environment, make him a center of gravity. After 2 years at Queen's, he transferred to the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League school, a significant step up in prestige and in the quality of the intellectual environment around him. He studied economics and physics simultaneously, a combination that seemed almost deliberately eccentric, but made perfect sense for a mind that wanted to understand both how the world worked and how value moved through it. He shared a 10-bedroom house near campus with a group of students, and he and a friend turned it into an unofficial nightclub on weekends, charging admission, managing the door, running a small but real operation. It was, in miniature, his first business. It made money. He noticed that making money was not that complicated if you identified something people wanted and provided it efficiently. He filed this observation away. His undergraduate thesis explored the economics of solar energy, not as an abstract exercise, but as a genuine attempt to understand whether and how humanity could transition away from fossil fuels. He was 20 years old, writing an economics thesis, and already thinking about planetary-scale energy systems. His professors found it interesting. Elon found it insufficient. A paper was not a solution. He wanted to build things. He was accepted to a PhD program in energy physics at Stanford University, one of the best programs in the world, at one of the best universities in the world in the heart of Silicon Valley, which in 1995 was erupting with a gold rush energy that was almost impossible to stand next to without catching fire. He enrolled. He lasted 2 days. 2 days. He looked at the PhD program, looked at the internet boom happening right outside Stanford's gates, looked at the ideas piling up in his head, and made a calculation. The world was changing faster than any academic program could track. The opportunities were now, not in 5 years. A PhD would teach him things. The world outside would let him do things. He chose doing. He walked out of Stanford, called his brother Kimball, and said something along the lines of, "Let's start a company." Kimball, who had by this point learned that when Elon decided something, it was generally wise to either join him or get out of the way, said yes. They had almost no money. They had a shared apartment. They had a computer. And Elon Musk had an idea, which, as history was about to demonstrate, was more than enough. Chapter 3. Silicon Valley or Bust. Let's set the scene. 1995. Silicon Valley. The internet is not yet the wallpaper of everyday life. It is still new, still weird, still something that most ordinary people regard with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Fewer than 1% of the world's population is online, and yet, in a handful of offices and garages and shared apartments scattered across the San Francisco Bay Area, a small army of young, sleep-deprived, dangerously caffeinated people are absolutely convinced that everything is about to change. They are correct. Elon Musk arrives into this environment with his brother Kimball, a combined bank account that would not impress anyone, and an idea for a company called Zip2. The concept was straightforward, almost deceptively so. Businesses, particularly newspapers and local companies, needed a way to put themselves on the internet. They needed maps, directories, searchable listings. They needed, essentially, a digital version of the Yellow Pages combined with mapping software, at a time when online maps were still a novelty that made people feel like they were living in a science fiction novel. It was not a glamorous idea. It was not the kind of idea that makes people gasp and reach for their checkbooks. But it was a useful idea, which Elon had learned, back in the days of his failed vote recorder inspiration from Edison's story, was more important than a flashy one. People pay for something useful. People tell their friends about something useful. Useful, executed well, becomes a business. Executing it well, however, required money they didn't have, and skills they were still developing, and a level of stamina that would have broken most people before the first month was out. They rented a tiny office in Palo Alto, and when I say tiny, I mean genuinely, depressingly small, a space that was less startup headquarters and more place where hope goes to be tested. They had a single computer. One. which meant that during the day, when they needed to do business meetings and sales calls and look like a functioning company, the computer was the business computer. At night, when the performance of being a company could be dropped, it became Elon's workstation, where he coded for hours, often until 4 or 5 in the morning, before catching a few hours of sleep on a futon they had wedged into the corner of the office. The futon was not a lifestyle choice. They couldn't afford an apartment. Showering happened at the YMCA nearby, where a basic membership was cheap enough to fit into their razor-thin budget. They ate whatever was available and affordable, which in practice meant a lot of meals that required very little thought and even less money. Elon later recalled that his entire food budget during this period was approximately $1 a day. Hot dogs, oranges, the kind of diet that your body accepts under protest. Here is what's important about this period, though, and this is something that gets lost when people tell the Elon Musk story as a straightforward triumph narrative. He wasn't miserable. He was focused. There is a crucial difference. Misery is what happens when you're enduring something you don't want to be doing. Focus is what happens when you're doing exactly what you want to be doing, and the external conditions are simply the price of admission. Elon was paying the price of admission. He knew what he was paying it for. That made all the difference. He and Kimball cold-called newspapers. They drove around the Bay Area in a car that was one bad day away from retirement, walking into offices, pitching their product to people who weren't entirely sure what the internet was yet, let alone why they needed a presence on it. Most doors didn't open. Some slammed. A few slowly, cautiously cracked. The sales process was grinding and humbling and educational in the way that only repeated rejection can be. You learn very quickly which parts of your pitch are landing and which parts are making people glance at the exit. You learn how to read a room. You learn how to adjust. Elon was not, by nature, a natural salesman in the traditional sense. He lacked the easy warmth and studied charm of a born closer. What he had instead was something arguably more powerful, an absolute, unshakable belief in what he was selling, communicated with a directness that some people found off-putting and others found completely compelling. Slowly, the cracks in the doors widened. They signed their first clients, then more clients. The product worked, not perfectly, not without problems, but well enough that people who used it could see what it was becoming. They brought in a small amount of outside investment. They hired a few people. The office got marginally less depressing. The futon remained. Then the venture capitalists arrived. And here is where the story takes its first complicated turn. Because the arrival of serious money into a startup is not always the uncomplicated good news it might appear to be. Money comes with investors. Investors come with opinions. Opinions, when backed by ownership stakes and board seats, come with power. The venture capital firm Moore Davidow invested in Zip2, and almost immediately the dynamic shifted in ways that Elon had not fully anticipated. The investors wanted experienced management. They wanted, in the specific language of Silicon Valley venture capital, adult supervision, which is a phrase that sounds reasonable on paper and is absolutely infuriating in practice when you are the founder who built the thing from nothing and you are being told, politely but firmly, that you need a babysitter. A CEO was brought in. Elon was moved sideways, still involved, still contributing technically, but no longer running the company he had created. He was 24 years old and had just experienced, for the first time, the specific humiliation of being managed within something he had built. He did not enjoy it. He would not forget it. It would not be the last time it happened. Despite the internal turbulence, Zip2 kept growing. By 1999, it had signed deals with major newspaper companies, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and dozens of others. It was powering city guides and maps and business directories for publications across the country. It was, by any objective measure, a success. And then Compaq, one of the largest computer companies in the world at the time, bought it for $307 million. Elon's share, after 4 years of futon sleeping and YMCA showering and $1 food budgets and cold calls and investor politics and coding through the night, $22 million. $22 million, deposited into the account of a 27-year-old from Pretoria who had arrived in Canada less than a decade earlier with almost nothing. He held that number in his head for a moment. Then he started thinking about what to do next. Because here is the thing about Elon Musk that separates him from a certain category of entrepreneur who cashes out and disappears into comfortable obscurity. The money was never the point. The money was fuel. And he already knew exactly what he wanted to burn it on. He wanted to change how money itself worked. And after that, he wanted to go to Mars. One thing at a time. Chapter 4. PayPal and the First Taste of War. $22 million. Let's just sit with that for a second. Most people handed $22 million at age 27 would do something sensible with it. Buy a house, invest conservatively, perhaps acquire a boat, develop an opinion about wine, and spend the next several decades being quietly, comfortably wealthy. This is what sensible looks like. This is what the vast majority of human beings, presented with that specific windfall at that specific age, would do without a moment's hesitation. Elon Musk took $10 million and immediately put it into his next company. He kept the rest modest, a small apartment, a used McLaren F1 sports car that he bought secondhand and would later crash without insurance, because of course he would, and got back to work. The year was 1999. The internet boom was at full roar. Money was moving through Silicon Valley like floodwater, and everyone with a browser and a business plan was getting funded. It was, in retrospect, a bubble. But from inside a bubble, it just feels like the world finally understanding what you always knew was true. His new idea was X.com, and the idea was audacious even by the standards of a moment when audacity was in abundant supply. X.com would be an internet bank, a fully online financial institution, not a supplement to traditional banking, not a convenient add-on, but a complete replacement. One account that could hold your money, send payments, receive payments, pay bills, offer investment products, and do everything that a physical bank did without the physical bank. No branches, no tellers, no nonsense. This was, in 1999, a genuinely radical proposition. Online banking existed in a limited way, but the idea of trusting the internet with your life savings was not something most ordinary people were ready to embrace. The incumbent banks looked at the idea and saw either a joke or a threat, and responded accordingly with a combination of dismissal and quiet lobbying to make the regulatory environment as difficult as possible for newcomers. Elon did not find this discouraging. He found it clarifying. If the big players were worried, that meant the idea had teeth. He hired a team. He built the product with the same sleeves-rolled-up intensity he'd brought to Zip2, coding alongside his engineers, pushing for speed, pushing for simplicity, pushing for an experience that would make the average person feel like the future had arrived in their pocket. X.com launched in late 1999 and immediately attracted customers with an offer that was, for the time, almost shockingly generous. Sign up and receive $20 in your new account just for joining. Refer a friend and receive another $20. The referral program spread like a very profitable virus. Then something unexpected happened. A few blocks away in Palo Alto, a different company was building a different but eerily similar product. It was called Confinity. It was founded by a group of brilliant, competitive, and equally ambitious entrepreneurs, including a PayPal refugee named Peter Thiel and a Max Levchin, a Ukrainian-born engineering prodigy who could write code the way Mozart could write music, which is to say, faster and better than anyone around him could fully comprehend. Confinity had built something called PayPal, initially designed as a way to beam money between Palm Pilots, which tells you something about how fast technology moves, since Palm Pilots no longer exist, and most people under 30 have never held one. PayPal had pivoted to email-based payments and was growing at a rate that was making everyone in the valley pay attention. Two companies, same idea, same city, same moment. A collision was inevitable. In March 2000, X.com and Confinity merged. It was one of those mergers that is described publicly as a partnership of equals and is experienced internally as a barely controlled civil war. The two founding teams had different cultures, different technical philosophies, different visions for what the combined company should become. The X.com side, led by Elon, wanted to build the everything financial platform, the full internet bank, the complete replacement for traditional finance. The Confinity side wanted to focus tightly on payments, do that one thing brilliantly, and grow from there. These were not compatible visions, and the people holding them were not the type to shrug and compromise quietly. Elon was CEO of the merged company. He made decisions quickly and with supreme confidence, which was both his greatest strength and, in the specific context of managing a team of equals who had their own supreme confidence, a significant source of friction. He pushed for a shift from Linux servers to Microsoft infrastructure, a decision his engineers found baffling and infuriating in roughly equal measure. He pushed the company's brand toward X.com and away from PayPal, which the Confinity team felt was the stronger consumer brand. He pushed and pushed and pushed. In the summer of 2000, Elon got on a plane to Australia for a business trip and a brief vacation. It was, as it turned out, poorly timed. While he was in the air, somewhere over the Pacific, unreachable, the board met. The key members of the Confinity team had had enough. They laid out their concerns, their frustrations, their case for a change in leadership. The board listened. By the time Elon's plane landed, he was no longer CEO of the company he had founded and merged and built. He had been removed, quietly, efficiently, while he was 30,000 feet above the ocean. The new CEO was Peter Thiel. Let's be honest about what this moment was. It was a gut punch. A public, professional, deeply personal gut punch. Elon had put his money, his time, his identity into this company. He had driven it with everything he had, and his reward was being told by the people around him that they thought someone else should be in charge. He was 29 years old. He could have walked. He could have taken his shares, nursed his wounded pride, and moved on. That would have been understandable. That would have been human. Instead, he stayed. He remained the largest shareholder. He stayed involved. He watched as the company rebranded entirely as PayPal, abandoning the X.com name he'd championed, and watched as the product he had helped build grew into something enormous. In 2002, eBay acquired PayPal for $1.5 billion in stock. Elon's share, $180 million. He had been ousted from his own company and still walked away with $180 million. He was 30 years old. He was about to do something with that money that everyone around him, friends, colleagues, investors, his own family, was absolutely convinced was insane. He was going to build rockets, not invest in a rocket company, not advise a rocket company, build one, from scratch, with his own money, competing with Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and the entire industrial aerospace complex that had been building rockets with government contracts and billions of dollars for the better part of half a century. His friends staged what can only be described as an intervention. They showed him videos of rocket failures. Spectacular, fiery, catastrophic rocket failures, vehicles exploding on launch pads, disintegrating in the upper atmosphere, tumbling back to Earth in pieces. They were trying, with genuine affection, to talk him out of throwing his fortune into a hole in the ground that happened to be aimed at the sky. Elon watched the videos. He thanked his friends for their concern. Then he went and started a rocket company anyway. Chapter 5. 3 Rockets to Bankruptcy. Let's talk about what it actually takes to build a rocket. Not metaphorically, not inspirationally. Actually, physically, what it takes to build a machine that can lift itself off the surface of the Earth, punch through the atmosphere at several thousand miles per hour, survive temperatures that would melt most materials you've ever touched, and deposit a payload into orbit around a planet, before ideally coming back to be used again. It takes, first of all, physics. Brutal, unforgiving, non-negotiable physics. The rocket equation, derived by a Russian scientist named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1903, is one of the most tyrannical mathematical relationships in all of engineering. It dictates precisely how much fuel you need to move a given mass, a given distance, and the answer is always, always more than you want it to be. Rockets are mostly fuel. The actual useful payload, the thing you're trying to get to space, is a tiny fraction of the total weight sitting on the launch pad. The rest is fuel, and the structure to hold the fuel, and the engines to burn the fuel, and the engineering to make sure none of it kills everyone involved. It takes, second, extraordinary precision. A rocket is not a simple machine. It is thousands of components: valves, pumps, turbines, sensors, guidance systems, heat shields, stage separation mechanisms, every single one of which must work correctly, in sequence, under conditions of extreme heat and vibration and pressure, with no opportunity to pull over and check under the hood if something goes wrong. In rocketry, failure is not a setback. Failure is usually a fireball. It takes, third, money. Enormous, almost incomprehensible amounts of money. NASA's budget runs to billions of dollars annually. Lockheed Martin and Boeing had decades of government contracts, established supply chains, thousands of experienced engineers, and infrastructure built up over generations. The established cost of launching a single kilogram of payload to orbit in 2002 was somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. The entire industry had essentially accepted this as a fact of nature, the way you accept that winter is cold. Elon Musk looked at all of this and had what can only be described as a completely unreasonable reaction. He thought he could do it cheaper, better, faster with a startup. He incorporated space exploration technologies, SpaceX, in June 2002, operating initially out of a converted warehouse in El Segundo, California. He put in $100 million of his own money. He hired a small team of aerospace engineers, some of them veterans of established space companies, others young and brilliant and slightly amazed that someone was actually trying this. He became, as he would be at every company he ran, deeply technically involved, not just as an executive setting direction, but as an engineer, engaging with the actual problems, learning the physics and the manufacturing and the materials science with the same autodidactic ferocity he'd brought to everything since childhood. He set a goal that the industry found somewhere between amusing and offensive: dramatically reduce the cost of reaching orbit, not by 10%, not by 20, by a factor of 10, make it 10 times cheaper to get to space, and everything changes: satellites, science, exploration, and eventually, the thing that drove Elon more than any of it, the colonization of Mars. The rocket they designed was called Falcon 1, small by industry standards, capable of carrying a modest payload to low Earth orbit, but designed from the ground up to be manufactured efficiently, with reusability in mind, at a fraction of the cost of comparable vehicles. Every component that the established players bought from specialized suppliers, SpaceX looked at and asked, "Can we make this ourselves, better and cheaper?" The answer, repeatedly, was yes. They manufactured their own engines, their own avionics, their own structural components. Vertical integration, taken to an extreme that the industry had never seriously attempted. The first launch attempt was scheduled for 2006 from a launch site on Omelek Island, a tiny piece of land in the Kwajalein Atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so remote that getting equipment and people there was itself a logistical adventure. The team lived and worked on the island for months in conditions that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply inconvenient, surrounded by ocean, far from everything familiar, held together by the shared conviction that they were doing something that mattered. March 24th, 2006. Falcon 1 ignited. It lifted off the pad. For 25 seconds, it flew, rising, accelerating, beginning the arc that would carry it toward the heavens. Then a fuel leak caused a fire. The engine shut down. The rocket fell back and was destroyed on impact. 25 seconds. The team was devastated. These were people who had given years of their lives to this moment, who had moved to a remote Pacific island, who had poured their expertise and their passion into every component of that vehicle. Watching it fall was not an abstract professional setback. It was a visceral, physical blow. People cried. People sat in silence, staring at screens showing debris where a rocket had been. Elon gathered the team. He gave a speech that people who were there still talk about. He did not minimize what had happened. He did not pretend it wasn't painful. But he was not, he told them, stopping. They had learned things. They knew more now than they had known yesterday. They were going to take what they had learned and build a better rocket. That was the job. That was what they were there to do. He meant every word. You could tell he meant every word. Launch 2 came in March 2007. Falcon 1 flew higher this time, significantly higher. It reached space, technically, which was something. Then a roll control issue caused it to spin and lose control. It did not reach orbit. 2 launches. 2 failures. $100 million of Elon's personal fortune burning, quite literally, in the Pacific sky. He was also, simultaneously, running Tesla, which we will get to properly in the next chapter, but which demands a brief mention here because the timing is important. Tesla was hemorrhaging money. It was behind schedule. It was facing manufacturing crises, supplier problems, and the fundamental challenge of trying to build a new kind of car in an industry that had been doing things a certain way for 100 years. Elon had put money into Tesla too. The two companies were competing for resources, for attention, for the finite and rapidly depleting reserves of his personal fortune. His friends were worried, his investors were worried, his ex-wife was worried, people who admired him were worried. The rocket footage from the first two failures circulated as a kind of cautionary exhibit. Look what happens when you take on too much, when you bet everything on things that explode. August 2008, Launch 3. The rocket lifted off. It flew. It climbed through the atmosphere beautifully, and for a moment, a long, breathless, wonderful moment, it looked like this was it. This was the one. Then, during stage separation, the first and second stages collided. The vehicle was lost. 3 launches, 3 failures. The money was almost gone. Tesla was in crisis. The economy was collapsing. 2008 was not a year. Anyone was handing out investment capital generously. SpaceX had enough resources, Elon later calculated, for exactly one more launch attempt. 1. If the 4th flight failed, that was it. SpaceX would cease to exist. The employees would scatter. The dream of cheap, reusable rockets would be filed under "interesting idea didn't work." In the weeks between the 3rd failure and the 4th launch, Elon Musk did something remarkable. Or rather, he did not do something remarkable. He did not panic. He did not retreat. He did not sell his shares or liquidate his position or quietly prepare a graceful exit narrative. He went back to work. He and his engineers analyzed everything, every data point from 3 flights, every component, every decision. They made changes. They prepared. His personal finances were, by this point, a genuine crisis. He was borrowing money from friends to cover living expenses. He was maxing out credit cards. The man who had walked away from PayPal with $180 million was, 6 years later, broke. Not metaphorically broke, actually, functionally, running out of runway broke. September 28, 2008. Launch 4. Falcon 1 ignited. It lifted off. It climbed. The first stage separated. Cleanly, perfectly. The second stage ignited. The rocket kept climbing. The telemetry stayed green. Velocity increasing. Altitude increasing. Everything nominal. Everything is working. The team in the control room, people who had watched 3 rockets fail, who had given years of their lives to this moment, were barely breathing. 9 minutes after launch, Falcon 1 reached orbit. The control room erupted. People who had maintained professional composure through 3 failures and years of grinding work collapsed into each other, crying and laughing simultaneously in the way that humans do when relief and joy arrive together at a magnitude the body wasn't quite built to contain. Elon stood in front of his team and cried openly, without embarrassment, without restraint. He had not cried publicly after the failures. He cried now. It was the first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket in history to reach orbit. Nobody had ever done it. Not Boeing, not Lockheed, not any of the established giants with their decades of experience and their billions of government dollars. A startup, in 6 years, on a shoestring budget, had done what the industry had said couldn't be done. 6 weeks later, NASA awarded SpaceX a contract worth $1.6 billion to resupply the International Space Station. $1.6 billion, arriving like oxygen to a man who had been underwater for longer than was survivable. SpaceX was saved, Elon Musk was saved, and the space industry would never be the same again. Chapter 6. Tesla and the car nobody believed in. Let's be clear about something right away, because the story of Tesla is one of the most misunderstood in modern business history, and the misunderstanding matters. Elon Musk did not found Tesla. This surprises people. It surprises people because Elon Musk and Tesla are so completely fused in the public imagination that separating them feels almost grammatically incorrect. But the truth is that Tesla Motors was founded in July 2003 by 2 engineers named Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, 2 smart, passionate, genuinely visionary men who believed that electric cars didn't have to be ugly, slow, and apologetic. They believed an electric car could be something people actually wanted, something desirable, something that made gasoline-powered cars look like the inferior option. They were right. They were also, as it turned out, going to need help. Elon Musk came in during the first round of financing in 2004, investing $6.5 million and becoming chairman of the board. He was not yet CEO. He was a very engaged, very opinionated, very involved investor, the kind who shows up to meetings with detailed engineering feedback and strong views about every decision being made. He and Eberhard worked together, and they also clashed, in the way that two extremely confident people with slightly different visions inevitably clash when the stakes are high and the pressure is constant. The car they were building was called the Roadster. It was based on the Lotus Elise chassis, a lightweight British sports car, modified extensively to house an electric drivetrain and a battery pack made up of thousands of small lithium-ion cells, the same basic type used in laptop computers. The choice was controversial. Conventional automotive wisdom said you needed purpose-built battery technology for a car. Eberhard and his team said conventional automotive wisdom was wrong and proceeded to prove it by engineering a solution that worked. The concept was deliberate and strategically elegant. Don't start by trying to make an affordable electric car for everybody. Start by making an extraordinary electric car for people who can afford extraordinary things. Make it fast, genuinely, embarrassingly fast, faster than almost anything with a combustion engine. Make it beautiful. Make it the car that makes other car people stop and stare. Use the revenue and the reputation from that car to fund the next one, which will be slightly less expensive and reach more people. Use that to fund the next one. Work down the price curve, one model at a time, until electric cars are accessible to everyone. It was a brilliant strategy. Executing it was a different matter entirely. By 2007, Tesla was in serious trouble. The Roadster was behind schedule. Manufacturing costs were spiraling. The car that was supposed to cost around $65,000 to produce was coming in at over $100,000. Eberhard and the board were at war. The relationship between the founder and his investors had curdled past the point of repair. Eberhard was pushed out as CEO, then out of the company entirely, in a departure that was bitter and legally contested and left wounds that took years to heal. Elon stepped in as CEO in October 2008. The timing, as you may recall from the previous chapter, was not ideal. This was the same month that SpaceX was preparing its fourth and final rocket launch with the last of its money. Tesla was simultaneously burning through cash at a terrifying rate, facing a global financial crisis that had shut down the credit markets, and trying to finish building a car that kept revealing new and expensive problems every time someone looked at it closely. There is a word for what Elon Musk was experiencing in the autumn of 2008. Several words, actually. The polite version is pressure. The accurate version involves language unsuitable for general audiences. He invested his last remaining personal funds into Tesla, money he had, by his own account, borrowed. He was simultaneously trying to save two companies, both of which were genuinely days away from failure at various points during those months, with no personal financial cushion remaining. He was sleeping on friends' couches. He was in the middle of a divorce from his first wife, Justine. He was, by any objective measure, in the worst period of his adult life. He did not stop. The Roadster finally reached customers in 2008. And here is where the story shifts, because whatever the manufacturing nightmares and the cost overruns and the corporate warfare had cost, the product itself was extraordinary. The Tesla Roadster was unlike anything that had existed before. It went from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 4 seconds. It had a range of over 200 miles on a single charge. It was sleek and low and gorgeous, and it made absolutely no sound except the faint electric whine that sounded, to early drivers, like the future arriving. People who drove it came back changed. Car journalists who had spent careers celebrating the sound and fury of combustion engines found themselves writing things they hadn't expected to write. That this silent electric thing was more thrilling than almost anything they'd driven. That it made other sports cars feel suddenly primitive. That they hadn't understood, until they floored it in a Tesla Roadster, what an electric car could actually be. Word spread. Orders came in. The company stabilized. Not comfortably, not without continued crisis, but enough. Tesla raised more funding. It survived 2008, which was more than many companies managed. Then came the Model S. If the Roadster proved that electric cars could be exciting, the Model S, launched in 2012, proved they could be everything. It was a full-size luxury sedan, seating 5 adults comfortably, with a trunk in the front and a trunk in the back because there was no engine taking up space. It had a range that exceeded most people's weekly driving needs. It had a 17-inch touchscreen in the center console at a time when most car manufacturers were still arguing about whether to include a USB port. It received the highest safety rating ever recorded by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Consumer Reports gave it a score of 99 out of 100, and then, somewhat embarrassingly, admitted their rating system didn't quite have the vocabulary for a car this good. The automotive establishment, which had been watching Tesla with a mixture of amusement and mild concern, began to pay closer attention. Then came the factory. Elon acquired a massive former General Motors and Toyota facility in Fremont, California, a plant that had been shut down and was sitting empty, and turned it into the Tesla factory. This was not a smooth process. Manufacturing, as Elon discovered in ways that cost him sleep and sanity and significant quantities of hair, is completely different from engineering. You can design a perfect product on paper. You can build perfect prototypes. And then you have to figure out how to build thousands of them, then tens of thousands with consistent quality, on a schedule, at a cost that allows you to actually sell them profitably. Tesla struggled with manufacturing for years, genuinely, painfully struggled. Production targets were announced and missed. Analysts wrote articles about how the company would collapse. Short sellers, investors who profit when a stock price falls, bet billions of dollars against Tesla, convinced that the math didn't work, that the promises couldn't be kept, that the whole thing was a beautiful illusion. Elon responded to the short sellers with a level of personal animosity that occasionally crossed the line from passionate to unhinged, but that also reflected something real. He believed in what he was building with a ferocity that made the skepticism feel not just wrong, but almost offensive. He was not running a company. He was prosecuting a mission. The mission was to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. Everything else was in service of that. He slept on the factory floor during production crises, literally, brought a sleeping bag and laid it down in the middle of the manufacturing facility so that he was physically present when problems emerged at 3 in the morning, because problems in manufacturing always emerge at 3 in the morning. His employees found this either inspiring or alarming, depending on their proximity to the sleeping bag. The Model 3, Tesla's first genuinely mass-market vehicle, priced to reach ordinary consumers rather than wealthy early adopters, became the object of the most intense production battle in the company's history. Elon had promised it would be built at volumes the company had never approached. The reality was months of what he called production hell, a period of round-the-clock crisis management, technical failures, supplier problems, and sheer manufacturing complexity that pushed everyone involved to their absolute limits. They got through it. By 2020, Tesla was the most valuable car company in the world, more valuable than Toyota, more valuable than Volkswagen, more valuable than Ford and General Motors combined. A company that hadn't existed 20 years earlier, that the entire automotive establishment had dismissed as a fantasy, had become the benchmark against which every other car manufacturer on Earth was now measuring itself. Every major automaker on the planet is now scrambling to electrify their lineup. Every car company that spent years insisting that electric vehicles were a niche product for idealists is now pouring billions into battery technology and electric drivetrains, trying to catch up with a company that used to be the punchline of their industry jokes. Thomas Edison once said that he found 10,000 ways that didn't work. Elon Musk found quite a few of those himself building Tesla. The difference is that he found them in public, under constant scrutiny, with billions of dollars of other people's money on the line, while simultaneously running a rocket company. The car nobody believed in changed the world. The man who refused to stop believing in it changed the car industry, and he was remarkably not finished yet. Chapter 7. The Man Who Divorced Sleep. There is a question that comes up repeatedly when people study Elon Musk closely enough. Not the big philosophical questions, not is he good or bad, or will Mars work, or what is he actually trying to do with Twitter. Those are interesting questions, but they come later. The first question, the one that stops you before you even get to the philosophy, is simpler and more fundamental. How? How does one human being run 2 companies simultaneously? 2 companies that are each, individually, among the most complex and demanding enterprises on Earth, while also being a father, a public figure, a chief engineer, a chief product officer, a de facto spokesman, a fundraiser, and occasionally the person who personally responds to customer complaints on the internet at 2 in the morning. How does the math work? How does the time work? There are 24 hours in a day. This is not a negotiable physical constant. Elon Musk has 24 hours. You have 24 hours. The difference, apparently, is what gets done with them. The answer begins with sleep, or more precisely, with the deliberate, systematic reduction of sleep to the absolute minimum the human body will accept without complete collapse. Elon Musk has spoken about his sleep habits with a candor that is either admirably honest or quietly alarming depending on how much you know about sleep science. He aims for 6 hours. He often gets less. During crisis periods, and there have been many crisis periods, he has gone days operating on a handful of hours grabbed in fragments, on factory floors, on couches, on planes. Sleep researchers will tell you, uniformly and with considerable scientific backing, that chronic sleep deprivation degrades cognitive function, emotional regulation, decision-making, and physical health in ways that are serious and cumulative. They will tell you that people who believe they function well on minimal sleep are, in most cases, simply unaware of how impaired they are, because the impairment affects the very faculties they would use to assess impairment. Elon would probably tell you that he knows this and considers it an acceptable trade-off given what he is trying to accomplish. This is, depending on your perspective, either the mark of a man with extraordinary priorities or a man with an extraordinary blind spot about his own limitations. Possibly both. Beyond sleep, the answer involves scheduling. His days are carved into 5-minute blocks, not hours, not half hours, 5-minute increments. Every block has a purpose. Meetings are kept ruthlessly short or eliminated entirely. He has been famously, brutally direct about his hatred of meetings that don't produce decisions or actions. He once sent a company-wide email at SpaceX explaining that large meetings waste time and should be avoided, that if something can be handled by 2 people, it should not involve 10, and that if a meeting isn't serving you, you should leave it, in the middle of it without apology, because your time is a resource, and wasting it is not polite, it is expensive. His weeks are split, roughly, between his companies. Mondays and Thursdays at SpaceX, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at Tesla. Saturdays are reserved for engineering review at SpaceX. Sundays sometimes exist. This is the schedule in theory. In practice, crises don't respect schedules, and crisis has been a near-permanent condition across his various enterprises for most of the last 2 decades. He thinks in first principles. We established this earlier. But what that means in practice, day to day, is that he engages with problems at a level of technical depth that most CEOs simply don't. Most executives at his level manage through layers. They set direction, they review summaries, they make high-level decisions, and trust their teams to execute the details. Elon does this too, but he also goes several layers deeper, regularly. He will sit in an engineering meeting and engage with the specific physics of a rocket nozzle design, or the thermal management of a battery cell, or the stamping process for a car body panel, at a level of detail that surprises engineers who expect the CEO to nod thoughtfully and move on. This is simultaneously one of his greatest strengths and one of his most significant management challenges. It is a strength because it means bad ideas can't hide behind layers of hierarchy. If something doesn't make physical sense, Elon will find it. It is a challenge because it means that Elon's involvement in a decision can sometimes compress the space for his engineers to think independently, to try things, to take risks without the boss looking over their shoulder. The pace at which he operates also has a specific and well-documented effect on the people around him. Working for Elon Musk is, by most accounts, an experience that exists somewhere on a spectrum between exhilarating and completely unsustainable. The exhilaration comes from the scope of the work. These are not small problems, not incremental improvements, not the kind of projects you describe at a dinner party and watch people's eyes glaze over. The people who work for Elon are working on rockets and electric cars and tunnels and brain-computer interfaces and things that didn't exist 5 years ago. That means something. That pulls people forward. The unsustainability comes from the expectations. Elon sets deadlines the way other people make wishes, with feeling and conviction and limited regard for physical constraints. Timelines that his own engineers know are impossible get announced publicly, which creates a peculiar double pressure, the internal pressure of trying to actually hit the target and the external pressure of the world watching to see whether you miss it. Missing it publicly, repeatedly, has become almost a Tesla and SpaceX tradition, the joke being that you take whatever date Elon announces and add a year or 2, and you'll be closer. And yet, the rockets launch. The cars exist. The things get built. Late, often, imperfectly, sometimes, but built in the end, which is more than can be said for the countless projects that died because someone decided the timeline was unrealistic and stopped pushing. There is a management concept sometimes called the reality distortion field, a term originally applied to Steve Jobs, describing the ability of certain leaders to convince people around them that impossible things are achievable, and in doing so, make them achievable. Elon has a version of this. Not through charm exactly. His interpersonal style is too blunt, too direct, too lacking in the warm lubrication that makes other people's charisma work so smoothly. His version operates through sheer, almost physical force of belief. He believes the thing can be done so completely, so visibly, so unwaveringly, that the people around him find their own doubts eroding in proximity to his certainty. This can be a gift. It can also be a pathology. Because the flip side of refusing to accept that things can't be done is occasionally refusing to accept feedback that things are going wrong. The same stubbornness that kept SpaceX alive through 3 rocket failures can make it difficult to hear a team member explaining that a particular approach is not working and needs to change. The same intensity that drives 20-hour workdays can curdle, when sustained too long, into a brittleness that makes nuance difficult and empathy scarce. Former employees describe working for Elon in terms that are strikingly consistent across companies and across years. The work is meaningful, and the standards are brutal, and the man himself is somewhere between a force of nature and a difficult parent, capable of great warmth and recognition when things go well, capable of withering public criticism when they don't. People leave his companies having done the best work of their lives, sometimes having been treated in ways they didn't deserve, usually with a complicated mixture of pride and relief. He has acknowledged some of this. Not always gracefully, and not always completely, but he has said in interviews that he knows he is not an easy person to work for, that the demands he places on others are the same demands he places on himself, and that he is aware this doesn't make the demands easier to live with. It is worth noting, in the middle of all this, that the pressure has costs for Elon personally that go beyond sleep deprivation. There have been very public breakdowns, most notably a 2018 appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast where he smoked marijuana on camera and seemed to be a man carrying a weight that was genuinely too heavy, not performing casualness so much as reaching for it desperately. There was a period around the same time when he described on Twitter working 100-hour weeks, being unable to leave the factory, missing his own birthday, the toll it was taking being simply unsustainable, and Tesla's share price dropped significantly because investors weren't sure if the CEO was having a breakdown. He wasn't, exactly, but he was a man at the edge of what a human being can sustain, staring into that edge with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion that was hard to watch. He kept going. He always kept going. This is, ultimately, what defines the working life of Elon Musk more than any specific achievement or any specific failure. Not the rockets or the cars or the billions of dollars or the impossible timelines or the management controversies. The defining characteristic is the refusal to stop. The absolute, categorical, almost inhuman refusal to stop. Whether that makes him an inspiration or a warning or both at once is a question worth sitting with, because the honest answer is that it makes him both. The same engine that changed the space industry and the car industry, and is reaching for still more runs on a fuel that is not renewable. Even Elon Musk, it turns out, is made of something finite. He just hasn't found the limit yet. Chapter 8. Love, Loss, and Life at Full Speed. There is a version of the Elon Musk story that skips this chapter entirely. That version stays safely in the territory of rockets and cars and batteries and market capitalizations, where everything can be measured and graphed and explained in terms of inputs and outputs. That version is easier to tell. It is also, in a fundamental way, dishonest, because behind the monument, behind the brand, behind the relentless public performance of ambition, there is a human being, a complicated, wounded, searching, loving, failing human being. And that human being's story deserves to be told with the same honesty as everything else. Let's start at the beginning of Elon's personal life, which means starting with Justine. Justine Wilson was a Canadian student at Queen's University when Elon met her, back in those early undergraduate days we visited in Chapter 2. She was smart and creative and literary, an aspiring novelist with a sharp wit and a strong sense of self that was not inclined to disappear quietly into someone else's orbit, which made her, in some ways, a challenging match for a man who generated his own gravitational field and had a tendency to make everything around him about the mission. Their courtship was characteristically Elon. He showed up at her dorm room uninvited with 2 ice cream cones, having remembered that she'd mentioned liking a particular flavor. It was charming. It was also a preview of a relationship dynamic that would define their years together. Elon pursuing what he wanted with complete focus, Justine navigating the experience of being wanted by someone who pursued everything with complete focus. They married in 2000 during the X.com years and built a life together in California that from the outside looked like a fairy tale. The mansion, the success, the social world of Silicon Valley at its most gilded. They had children, eventually 6 boys, though the story of those children begins with unbearable grief. Their first son, Nevada Alexander Musk, was born in 2002. He was 10 weeks old when he died of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. The thing that happens in the night, without warning, without explanation, that parents cannot prevent or predict or understand. Elon and Justine put Nevada down for a nap, and Nevada did not wake up. There are no words adequate to this. There is nothing to say about the loss of a 10-week-old child that doesn't collapse under its own insufficiency. Elon has spoken about Nevada's death rarely and briefly, in the way of someone who has placed something in a room inside himself and cannot go back into that room without the grief becoming unmanageable. What he has said is that he chose, in the aftermath, to deal with it by not dealing with it, by returning to work, by moving forward, by refusing to sit inside the loss. Justine dealt with it differently. And the difference in how they grieved, his retreat into work, her need to process and feel and speak, was one of the early fractures in a marriage that would eventually break completely. They had 5 more sons through IVF, twins Griffin and Xavier, then triplets Damien, Saxon, and Kai. A full, loud, extraordinary household. And still, despite the family and the success and the life that looked from the outside like everything a person could want, the marriage was quietly failing. Justine later wrote about their relationship in a piece that was brave and painful and illuminating. She described feeling, increasingly, like a supporting character in Elon's story, rather than a full person in her own right. She described a dynamic where his certainty about everything, including eventually about who she was and what she needed, left little room for her own complexity to exist. She described the specific loneliness of being married to someone who is mentally somewhere else, even when physically present, whose inner world is so consuming that the outer world, including the people in it who love him, sometimes struggles to fully penetrate. They divorced in 2008. The timing placed it squarely in the middle of the worst period of Elon's professional life, the year of the 3rd rocket failure, the Tesla crisis, the personal bankruptcy, the maximum pressure from every direction simultaneously. Justine has said, and it seems credible, that the marriage had been struggling for years before the paperwork made it official. Within weeks of the divorce being finalized, Elon was in a relationship with the British actress Tallulah Riley. They married in 2010. They divorced in 2012. They remarried in 2013. They divorced again in 2016. This sequence of events, marry, divorce, remarry, divorce, is unusual enough that it demands acknowledgement without necessarily demanding explanation, because the explanations are private and complicated and belong to the people involved. What it suggests, gently, is a man who wants very much to love and be loved, who approaches relationships with the same intensity he brings to everything, and who has not always found a way to reconcile that intensity with the patience and compromise and sustained attention that relationships require. The same qualities that make him extraordinary in a laboratory or a boardroom create specific challenges in a kitchen, at a breakfast table, in the daily unremarkable intimacy of a shared life. Then there is Grimes. Claire Bouchard, known professionally as Grimes, the Canadian musician and artist, entered Elon's life around 2018, and their relationship was one of the more unlikely and genuinely touching pairings in recent celebrity history. She was avant-garde and artistic and deeply weird in the most appealing possible sense. He was a tech billionaire who had just bought a flamethrower company for fun. They had bonded, improbably, over a shared joke about artificial intelligence, and a 19th-century philosophical thought experiment, which they had apparently arrived at independently and found each other through on Twitter. They had a son in 2020, named XAA12, pronounced, after some public debate and a California legal intervention requiring standard alphabet characters, as X. They had a daughter, Exa Darksideral, in 2021. Their relationship was on and off with a frequency that made it difficult to track, and they have maintained an amicable co-parenting arrangement through the fluctuations. During this same general period, Elon had additional children with Shivan Zilis, a top executive at his Neuralink company. Twin children, born in 2021, whose existence became public knowledge in 2022 through court documents rather than through any announcement. This revelation landed with the force of a headline that nobody quite knew how to process, not because it was scandalous exactly, but because it added to a picture of a personal life operating at a pace and complexity that seemed to reflect the same maximalist approach Elon brought to everything else. He has, at last count, 11 children by 3 women. He has spoken about his belief that declining birth rates represent a genuine civilizational risk, and that people who care about the future should have more children. He is, in his personal life, practicing what he preaches, though the specific circumstances are unusual enough that this observation lands differently than it might for someone applying the same philosophy in more conventional ways. What can be said, honestly and without judgment, is that fatherhood matters to him. The children he has raised in proximity, his older sons particularly, speak of a father who is present when he is present, who is deeply engaged, who instills in them the same curiosity and ambition that defines his own life, who also disappears, regularly and completely, into the work, who is, in the specific texture of daily family life, the same person he is everywhere else, extraordinary in bursts, difficult to hold on to consistently, a force of nature that you love and miss and sometimes cannot quite keep up with. There is a through line in all of Elon's personal relationships, if you look for it. A pattern that connects the marriage to Justine and the relationships since, the professional partnerships that ended badly and the ones that endured, the children he is close to and the children navigating more complicated relationships with their father. The pattern is this. Elon Musk gives everything to whatever has his attention at that moment. When his attention is on you, there is nobody more present, more engaged, more genuinely interested in who you are and what you think. When his attention is somewhere else, which is most of the time, because there is always a rocket to fix or a car to build or a problem to solve that feels to him like it cannot wait. The absence is total. This is not cruelty. It is not indifference. It is something more complicated and harder to respond to, a man whose love is real, but whose attention is the scarcest resource he possesses, rationed by a mind that is almost always somewhere between here and the stars. His son Xavier, now going by Vivian, having come out as transgender in 2022 and having legally changed her name, simultaneously and pointedly, away from Musk, issued a court filing that cited not just gender identity, but a desire to have no association with her biological father. It was a public wound, reported in every newspaper, interpreted 100 different ways. Elon has not spoken about it in detail publicly. What can be observed from the outside is that it hurts, that beneath the armor of ambition and productivity, there is a father who knows that the cost of being who he is includes costs he did not fully account for. He keeps going. He has always kept going. But if you want to understand Elon Musk, not the brand, not the meme, not the caricature, but the actual human being making actual decisions from inside an actual life, this chapter is where you find him. In the losses, in love, in the gap between who he wants to be and who he has time to be. That gap is where the most interesting truth lives. And it is, for all his extraordinary achievements, the one problem he has not yet figured out how to engineer his way out of. Chapter 9. Mars or Bust. Let's go back to the beginning of SpaceX. Not the business beginning. The emotional beginning. The reason. Because SpaceX is not, at its core, a rocket company. It is not a launch services provider or a satellite deployment business or a government contractor, though it is all of those things commercially. At its core, SpaceX is a response to a fear, a specific, serious, deeply felt fear that Elon Musk has carried since he was old enough to think about the long arc of human civilization. The fear is this, that humanity is fragile. Not in the everyday sense, not fragile like a person can be fragile, breakable by bad luck or bad health, fragile in the civilizational sense, fragile the way a species is fragile when it exists on a single planet, with a single biosphere, with no backup, no redundancy, no plan B. Fragile the way you are fragile when everything you are and everything you have ever built and everyone you have ever loved exists in one place, and that one place is subject to asteroid impacts and supervolcanic eruptions and pandemics and climate catastrophe and nuclear war and any number of other extinction-level events that the universe has demonstrated repeatedly and without sentiment, it is entirely willing to produce. Elon has described this fear in interviews with a directness that some people find refreshing and others find melodramatic. He is not performing concern about human extinction for effect. He genuinely lies awake thinking about it. He has said so. The thought that consciousness, this extraordinary, improbable, beautiful accident of evolution, the only known instance of the universe becoming aware of itself, could simply end, could be snuffed out by a rock or a virus or a bad century, and that nothing would remain, is something he finds genuinely, viscerally intolerable. The solution, as he sees it, is simple in concept and almost incomprehensibly difficult in execution. Humanity must become multiplanetary. We must establish a self-sustaining civilization on at least one other world, a civilization large enough and independent enough that if something catastrophic happens to Earth, the human story continues, a backup drive for civilization, an insurance policy for consciousness itself, and the world he has chosen for this purpose is Mars. Why Mars? Because of all the options available in our solar system, Mars is the least impossible. It is cold, averaging around -60 degrees Celsius, but not as cold as the outer planets. It has a thin atmosphere, mostly carbon dioxide, which is inadequate for breathing but sufficient for certain purposes and potentially transformable over very long timescales. It has water ice at its poles and possibly underground. It has a day that is almost exactly the same length as Earth's, 24 hours and 37 minutes, which matters for the biology of any creatures trying to live there. It is close enough that travel times, while measured in months rather than hours, are at least within the range of human endurance. It is, in short, the most habitable, uninhabitable place we can reach. Elon has said that he wants to die on Mars. Not on impact, he adds quickly, a joke he has made enough times that it has become a kind of verbal tick, deployed whenever the statement produces the alarm it invariably produces. He means that he wants Mars colonization to have progressed far enough within his lifetime that choosing to live and die there is an available option. He means that he wants to see the beginning of something that will outlast him. A foothold, a seed, a first irreversible step toward the multiplanetary future he believes is necessary for humanity's survival. This is not a new dream. It has been with him since childhood. Those science fiction novels in Pretoria, the ones that described futures humanity hadn't built yet. Isaac Asimov, Douglas Adams, Robert Heinlein. The Foundation series, which imagines a group of people taking deliberate, long-term action to preserve civilization against collapse. Elon has cited Foundation as one of the most influential things he ever read, and if you understand Foundation, you understand something essential about how Elon sees his own role in history. He is not just building companies. He is, in his own mind, doing something closer to what Asimov's Hari Seldon does, identifying an existential risk to civilization and taking systematic action to reduce it, on a timescale that extends far beyond his own life. This is an enormous thing to carry around. It is, depending on your perspective, either the most important mission any living person has undertaken, or a grandiose self-narrative that says more about one man's ego than about the actual needs of humanity. Both things can be partially true simultaneously, and probably are. What is not in dispute is what SpaceX has actually built in service of this vision. The Falcon 9 rocket, SpaceX's workhorse vehicle, has become the most reliable launch vehicle in history. It has flown hundreds of times, and crucially, its first stage lands itself. It comes back. After boosting a payload toward orbit, the first stage reorients, reignites its engines, and settles gently onto a landing pad, or onto a drone ship in the middle of the ocean, with a precision that still looks like a special effect even after you have watched it dozens of times. A rocket booster, used once and recovered, then refurbished and launched again. The same booster, again and again and again. This was the thing the aerospace industry said was impossible. SpaceX does it routinely. The cost reduction this enables is real and significant. Reusability is the key to making space economically accessible, in the same way that reusable aircraft are the key to affordable flight. A world where rockets are disposable, where you throw away the vehicle with every launch, is a world where space remains prohibitively expensive. A world where rockets land and fly again is a world where the economics start to make sense for a much wider range of missions. But the Falcon 9 is not the vehicle that goes to Mars. For that, SpaceX has been developing something in a different category entirely: Starship. Starship is, by any measure, the largest and most powerful rocket ever built. It stands nearly 400 feet tall, taller than the Saturn V that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. It is designed to be fully and rapidly reusable, both the upper stage spacecraft and the super heavy booster that launches it, both recovered, both reflown, ideally within hours of landing. It is designed to carry 100 metric tons to low Earth orbit, and eventually to carry large numbers of people on the months-long journey to Mars. It is also, to put it mildly, a work in progress. The early Starship test flights were spectacular in every sense of the word. Several of the prototypes exploded, in ways that were simultaneously catastrophic and somehow beautiful. Enormous stainless steel rockets rising majestically before disassembling themselves at altitude in great blooming clouds of fire and vapor. Elon's response to each explosion was consistent. He called them rapid unscheduled disassemblies. He pointed out the data collected, he thanked the teams, and he moved immediately to the next test. By 2023 and 2024, Starship was beginning to demonstrate the things it needed to demonstrate: launches reaching higher altitudes, controlled flight, re-entry. The chopsticks catch system, enormous mechanical arms on the launch tower designed to literally catch the returning super heavy booster out of the air, was successfully demonstrated, producing what was genuinely one of the most astonishing engineering images of the decade. A booster the size of a 30-story building falling from the sky, caught by a pair of metal arms. The kind of thing that makes you stop and stare and wonder whether you are watching actual reality. NASA has selected Starship as the vehicle for its Artemis program, the mission to return humans to the moon. Which means that before humans walk on Mars, they will likely walk on the moon from a SpaceX Starship. The company that started in a warehouse in El Segundo, that nearly died 3 times in its first 6 years, is now the vehicle through which humanity returns to the surface of another world. Elon's Mars timeline has been, like all his timelines, optimistic to the point of fiction in its specifics. He has said humans on Mars by 2024, by 2026. The dates have shifted. They will probably shift again. What has not shifted is the direction. SpaceX is building the hardware. The launches are getting more capable. The cost is coming down. The pace is accelerating. Whether humans reach Mars in Elon's lifetime, whether he personally makes the journey, which he has said he intends to, is genuinely unknowable. The technical challenges remaining are immense. Keeping humans alive for a 6-month transit through deep space, exposed to radiation levels that existing spacecraft shielding struggles to manage, landing enormous vehicles safely on a planet with enough atmosphere to create problems but not enough to solve them. Building habitats, growing food, generating power, creating, from scratch, the infrastructure of survival on a world that is doing everything in its power to kill you. These are not small problems. They are some of the hardest problems in the history of engineering. Elon knows this. His engineers know this. The difference between SpaceX and every previous attempt to seriously reckon with Mars colonization is that SpaceX is actually building hardware and testing it, iterating at a pace that no government program has ever matched, treating each failure as data and each success as a foundation for the next attempt. It may work. It may take longer than anyone hopes. It may reveal obstacles that require solutions nobody has thought of yet, but it is happening in a way that nothing like it has ever happened before. And underneath all of it, underneath the engineering and the timelines and the test flights and the business strategy, is a man who looked at the night sky as a child in South Africa and felt, with a seriousness that has never left him, that humanity's story was too important to leave confined to a single fragile world. That child is still there, still looking up, still absolutely convinced that the stars are not decoration, they are the destination. Chapter 10. Buying Twitter and Breaking the Internet. On April 14, 2022, Elon Musk made an offer to buy Twitter for $54.20 per share, a total of $44 billion. And the internet, with magnificent and appropriate irony, absolutely lost its mind. Twitter lost its mind on Twitter. Journalists lost their minds on Twitter. Twitter employees lost their minds, presumably also on Twitter, possibly on company time. Politicians issued statements. Celebrities announced departures. Academics wrote urgent threads. The discourse machine that Elon Musk was attempting to purchase turned itself, with maximum velocity, toward the singular topic of whether Elon Musk should be allowed to purchase it. It was, in its way, perfect. To understand why Elon wanted Twitter, you have to understand what Twitter meant to Elon, which is different from what Twitter meant to most people. For the average user, Twitter was a place to follow news, argue with strangers, share opinions, and occasionally have something moderately amusing go mildly viral. For Elon Musk, Twitter was something closer to a nervous system. It was where he announced products, responded to customers, fought with critics, shared memes, recruited engineers, moved markets with single sentences, and, perhaps most importantly, engaged directly with the world without the mediation of press offices or public relations professionals or any of the other buffers that normally stand between powerful people and unfiltered reality. He had, by 2022, over 80 million followers. He was one of the most influential voices on the platform by any measurable metric, and he had become increasingly convinced that the platform was broken, not technically, but philosophically, that its content moderation policies were inconsistent, politically biased, and fundamentally at odds with what he considered the foundational value of a functional public square: free speech. The free speech argument is where the story gets complicated, because it is simultaneously sincere and incomplete. Since Elon's discomfort with platform censorship and content moderation predates his Twitter acquisition by years, and his general libertarian instinct toward minimal restrictions on speech is a genuine ideological position rather than a convenient post hoc justification. Incomplete, because the specific cases that seemed to animate him most were cases where voices he agreed with had been restricted, and free speech, applied selectively, is something other than free speech. This tension, between the principle and the practice, would define the entire chaotic saga of what happened after he bought the thing. Getting to the purchase was itself a drama of considerable proportions. In January 2022, Elon began quietly buying Twitter stock. By April, he had accumulated enough to be the largest single shareholder. Twitter's board offered him a seat. He declined, which in retrospect seems like foreshadowing. Instead, he made the offer to buy the whole company. Twitter's board initially resisted, deploying a poison pill defense designed to make a hostile takeover prohibitively expensive. Then, after some negotiation and considerable drama, they accepted. $44 billion. Deal done. Then Elon tried to get out of the deal. In July 2022, citing concerns about the number of bot accounts on the platform, fake automated accounts that Twitter had been disclosing as less than 5% of users, a figure Elon disputed, he announced he was terminating the agreement. Twitter sued him to force completion of the purchase. The legal battle promised to be spectacular, lengthy, and expensive, with lawyers on both sides preparing for a trial that would have required Elon to hand over his text messages and submit to deposition under oath. In October 2022, Elon reversed course again and agreed to complete the acquisition at the original price. On October 27, 2022, he walked into Twitter's San Francisco headquarters carrying a porcelain sink, posted a video of himself doing so with the caption, "Let that sink in," and became the owner of one of the most influential communications platforms in human history. He fired the CEO. He fired the CFO. He fired several members of senior leadership. He assembled a small group of trusted lieutenants and began what he called a transformation of the company, and what observers across the political spectrum variously described as a liberation, a disaster, an experiment, a purge, and several other things that are not printable in a family-friendly biography. What followed was one of the most publicly visible corporate restructurings in history, conducted almost entirely in real time, on the platform being restructured, by the man doing the restructuring. Within days, he laid off approximately half of Twitter's workforce, roughly 3,700 employees, via an email that arrived in inboxes late on a Friday night. informing people their access had been revoked and their employment terminated. The layoffs were widely criticized as chaotic and legally problematic. Some employees who had been let go were subsequently asked to return when it became apparent that their specific skills were, in fact, necessary. Several departments were reduced to skeleton crews or effectively eliminated. Then he sent an email to the remaining employees describing an expectation of hardcore work, long hours, high intensity, extraordinary commitment, the same culture he had built at SpaceX and Tesla. He gave people a deadline to click a link confirming their willingness to continue under these conditions. Those who didn't click would receive 3-month severance. A significant number of people did not click. Twitter lost, in the space of a few weeks, a substantial portion of its institutional knowledge, its engineering depth, and its trust and safety infrastructure. The teams responsible for content moderation, handling illegal content, protecting elections, and managing the various categories of harmful material that platforms of this scale inevitably attract. The content moderation question was, and remains, the most contested aspect of Elon's stewardship. He restored a large number of previously banned accounts, including several that had been removed for violations of Twitter's policies around misinformation and harassment. He framed this as a free speech restoration. Critics framed it as an open invitation to the worst actors on the internet to return to a platform that was simultaneously gutting its capacity to manage them. The Twitter Files, a series of internal documents released through selected journalists, revealed details of previous moderation decisions, including cases where the platform had suppressed certain stories at the request of government agencies or under pressure from political actors. These revelations were significant and raised legitimate questions about the previous regime's practices. They were also deployed in the public conversation with a selective emphasis that sometimes obscured as much as it illuminated. Advertisers left. Major brands, unwilling to have their products appearing next to content they found objectionable, paused their spending. Twitter's advertising revenue dropped significantly, by some estimates by more than half in the months following the acquisition. This was an existential problem for a platform that was almost entirely advertising-funded, carrying substantial debt from the leveraged buyout Elon had structured to finance the purchase. He responded to advertiser departures with characteristic subtlety, posting publicly that certain departing advertisers could go do something anatomically challenging to themselves. This did not immediately resolve the advertising situation. He introduced Twitter Blue, a subscription service offering account verification and other features for $8 a month, as part of a strategy to diversify revenue away from advertising dependency. The rollout was bumpy. Verified accounts were briefly impersonated at scale, producing a wave of fake announcements from pharmaceutical companies and political figures that required rapid emergency intervention. The verification system was adjusted multiple times. He renamed the company X. He replaced the iconic Twitter bird logo with an X, changed the domain, altered the brand identity that had been Twitter's entire public face for 16 years, and announced a vision of X as an everything app, a super application combining social media, payments, commerce, and communication in a single platform. The ambition was recognizable. It was, essentially, the original X.com vision from 1999, the everything financial platform dream that had been his first great idea before PayPal absorbed it. Elon was, in a sense, trying to finish something he had started 25 years earlier. Whether X achieves that vision remains genuinely open. The platform has stabilized in some ways. It still exists, still functions, still hosts hundreds of millions of users. It has lost significant advertiser revenue and a meaningful portion of its high-profile users, who have migrated to competitors including Threads, Blue Sky, and others. It has also retained enormous relevance as a place where news breaks, where public figures communicate, where discourse, chaotic, contested, occasionally illuminating, continues to happen in real time. What Twitter, X, under Elon reveals, more than anything else, is the specific nature of his relationship with control. He did not buy Twitter because it was a good investment. By almost any financial analysis, $44 billion for a declining advertising platform carrying significant operational costs was not a deal that made obvious sense. He bought it because he wanted to shape it, because the platform had enormous influence over public conversation, and he had strong opinions about how that conversation should be conducted, and he is not a person who responds well to having strong opinions without also having the ability to act on them. This is Elon at his most essential. The rockets, the cars, the tunnels, the brain chips, all of it traces back to the same impulse. He sees something broken, or something missing, or something that could be better, and he cannot leave it alone. He has to try. The results are not always what he intended. The costs are sometimes higher than he forecasted. The journey is reliably, spectacularly messy. But he tries, with everything he has, in front of everyone, without a safety net, without a backup plan, without the option of quiet retreat back to comfortable irrelevance. And trying, for better and for worse, changes things. Chapter 11. The Richest Man in the World and What It Cost. Let's talk about money. Not because money is the most interesting thing about Elon Musk. It isn't, not even close. But because the scale of it is so extraordinary that ignoring it would be like writing about the ocean and declining to mention that it is wet. At his peak in November 2021, Elon Musk was worth approximately $320 billion. $320 billion, a number so large it resists comprehension in the way that astronomical distances resist comprehension. You can say the words, you can write the digits, but the human brain was not built to genuinely feel the difference between 1 billion and 300 billion any more than it was built to feel the difference between 1 mile and the distance to the nearest star. To put it differently, if you had started spending $1 million every single day from the moment Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas in 1492, you would not yet have spent $320 billion. You would need another century and a half. He became, by this measure, the richest human being in recorded history. And here is the thing about that wealth that is easy to misunderstand. It is almost entirely theoretical. It exists not as cash in accounts or gold in vaults, but as equity, shares in Tesla and SpaceX primarily, whose valuations fluctuate with market conditions, investor sentiment, quarterly earnings, and occasionally a single tweet. When Tesla's stock rises, Elon becomes billions richer. When it falls, he becomes billions poorer. In 2022, as interest rates rose and tech valuations contracted and the Twitter acquisition created concerns about his focus and judgment, his net worth dropped by more than $200 billion in a single year, the largest personal wealth destruction in history. He remained, even after that drop, extraordinarily wealthy. But the volatility is worth understanding because it reflects something important about the nature of what he has built. His wealth is not the product of accumulation, of saving and investing and compounding over decades. It is the product of creation. He built things that the market decided were enormously valuable. If the market changes its mind, the wealth changes accordingly. It is, in that sense, less a resource than a scoreboard, a constantly updating measure of what the world currently thinks the things he has built are worth. What has all of this wealth enabled, beyond the obvious material comforts? Primarily, it has enabled the projects. SpaceX could not exist without the ability to absorb years of losses and catastrophic failures before achieving commercial viability. Tesla could not have survived its near-death experiences without Elon's willingness to put his personal fortune on the line as a last resort. The audacity of the enterprises he has undertaken is only possible because the financial resources exist to absorb the inevitable costs of audacity. In this sense, his wealth is less a destination than a mechanism, the thing that makes the other things possible. But wealth at this scale also does something else. It changes the relationship between a person and the world in ways that are subtle and not always healthy. When you are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the normal feedback mechanisms that keep human beings calibrated, social friction, financial consequences, the need to persuade others, the experience of being told no and having no means to override it, gradually erode. The world begins to accommodate you. People who disagree with you find ways to express that disagreement more gently, or not at all. The people immediately around you are, almost inevitably, people whose proximity to your wealth gives them an interest in your continued good opinion. This is the specific danger of extreme wealth, and it is a danger Elon has not always successfully navigated. His other ventures during this period illustrate both the reach and the limits of what one extraordinarily resourced human being can attempt simultaneously. Neuralink, founded in 2016, working on brain-computer interface technology, implantable devices that can read neural signals and potentially allow direct communication between human brains and computers. The medical applications are genuinely significant. For people with paralysis, locked-in syndrome, or other conditions that sever the connection between will and action, a device that reads neural signals and translates them into computer commands could be transformative. Neuralink's first human trial, announced in early 2024, involved a patient who had received the implant and was able to control a computer cursor with his thoughts, a milestone that was real and meaningful regardless of what one thinks about Elon's broader ambitions for the technology. Those broader ambitions, a future in which human cognition is augmented by seamlessly integrated AI, in which the boundary between biological and digital intelligence becomes permeable, are the kind of vision that sits at the intersection of profound possibility and legitimate ethical alarm. The questions they raise about identity, consent, privacy, and the distribution of cognitive enhancement across economic lines are serious and not yet answered. The Boring Company, founded in 2016 after Elon got stuck in Los Angeles traffic and decided with characteristic Elon logic that the solution was to dig tunnels. The vision was a network of underground tunnels carrying electric vehicles at high speed beneath congested cities, eliminating surface traffic by moving it underground. The Las Vegas Convention Center Loop, a network of tunnels beneath the Las Vegas convention area, carrying Tesla vehicles between terminals, is operational and has carried millions of passengers. The broader vision of city-scale tunnel networks has proven more resistant to realization, caught between the engineering challenges of urban tunneling and the political complexities of urban infrastructure. It is a real company doing real things, but the gap between the announced vision and the current reality is, even by Elon's standards, substantial. XAI. Founded in 2023, Elon's artificial intelligence company, developing a large language model called Grok, integrated into X. The founding came with considerable irony, given that Elon had been one of the original co-founders of OpenAI, the nonprofit AI safety organization that eventually became the company behind ChatGPT, before departing from its board in 2018 amid disagreements about direction. He had subsequently become one of OpenAI's most vocal critics, arguing that it had abandoned its safety mission and become a closed, commercially driven enterprise that posed the very risks it had been founded to prevent. He sued OpenAI in 2024, alleging breach of its founding mission, a lawsuit that produced extensive public back and forth and revealed, if nothing else, that the relationship between Elon and his former AI project had curdled dramatically. His concerns about artificial intelligence are genuine and long-standing. He has been warning publicly about the existential risks of advanced AI for over a decade, calling it potentially the most dangerous technology humanity has ever developed, potentially more dangerous than nuclear weapons, capable of producing outcomes that no human intended and no human can reverse. He sat on the board of OpenAI specifically because he believed that AI development needed to be done carefully, transparently, with safety as the primary consideration rather than commercial advantage. The irony, and it is a significant irony, is that he then founded his own AI company. The explanation he offers is that since powerful AI is going to be developed regardless, it is better to have him involved in developing it than to cede that ground entirely to others. This argument is coherent. It is also, as critics have noted, remarkably convenient. Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, emerged in 2024 when Elon aligned himself publicly and enthusiastically with Donald Trump's presidential campaign. It was an alignment that surprised some observers, given that Elon had previously positioned himself as politically independent and had supported Democratic candidates in earlier cycles. His explanation centered on concerns about government spending, regulatory overreach, and what he characterized as a weaponization of federal agencies against political opponents and against innovation. The Doge Project, a quasi-official advisory initiative aimed at identifying and eliminating government waste, was announced with the numerical ambition of cutting $2 trillion from the federal budget and launched with a public energy that generated enormous headlines and significant controversy in roughly equal measure. The actual mechanisms, legal authority, and achievable scope of the initiative remained contested throughout its early operation. What Doge represented, beyond its specific policy ambitions, was something new in Elon's public life, an unambiguous political alignment, a willingness to be identified not just as a businessman or a technologist, but as a political actor with a side, a team, an agenda. This was a significant shift. The business consequences were immediate and measurable. Tesla sales dropped in markets where the political valence of buying a Tesla had shifted as the car became associated in some consumers' minds with a political figure they opposed. Protests appeared at Tesla dealerships in multiple countries. Whether the political engagement reflects a genuine ideological evolution, a specific set of interests being pursued through political means, or something else entirely, is a question that different observers answer differently, and that probably contains elements of all three. What can be said is that at this point in his life, Elon Musk has accumulated a breadth of involvement in space, in automotive, in social media, in AI, in neuroscience, in tunneling, in politics, that has no real precedent in modern history. There is no obvious comparison. Howard Hughes comes up sometimes, another eccentric billionaire who owned an airline, designed aircraft, and eventually descended into an isolation that looked from the outside like madness. But Hughes was primarily an inheritor and an acquirer. Elon builds. The scale of original creation distinguishes him from almost everyone. The costs of this scope are real, and they are visible. The relationships damaged by the pace and the intensity, the promises made and not kept, the public behavior that sometimes undermines the serious work, the management decisions that have been brilliant and the ones that have been reckless, the employees who gave years of their lives and left wounded, the adversaries made unnecessarily through an online presence that mixes genuine insight with genuine cruelty in proportions that shift unpredictably. He has been accused, at various points, of securities fraud, of labor law violations, of discriminatory workplace practices, of misleading investors, of using his platforms to manipulate financial markets. Some of these accusations have resulted in settlements. Some have been dismissed. Some are ongoing. The legal record of a person operating at this scale and this speed across this many industries is inevitably complicated, and sorting genuine wrongdoing from the inevitable friction of disrupting multiple established industries simultaneously requires more care than either his defenders or his critics typically apply. What remains, underneath all of it, is the work. The rockets that land themselves, the cars that changed an industry, the satellites providing internet access to places that had none, the brain implant that let a paralyzed person move a cursor with a thought. These things exist. They would not exist without him. That is not nothing. That is, by any serious accounting, quite a lot. The question the world is still working out how to answer is what to do with a person who is simultaneously one of the most consequential builders in human history and one of the most destabilizing forces in contemporary public life. How to hold both things at once. How to assess a legacy that is still accumulating, that may look very different in 20 years than it does today, depending on whether Starship reaches Mars, whether Tesla's bet on sustainable transport proves decisive, whether the AI warnings prove prescient, whether the political alignment produces outcomes that history judges well or poorly. We don't know yet. The story isn't finished, and the man at the center of it, brilliant, difficult, visionary, reckless, generous, cruel, inspiring, alarming, always moving, never quite where you expect him to be, is not finished either, not even close. Chapter 12. The Verdict on Elon Musk. Every great story needs an ending. The problem with Elon Musk is that he refuses to provide one. He is, as of this telling, still here, still building, still posting things on X at 3 a.m. that make half the world cheer and the other half reach for their blood pressure medication, still announcing timelines that his engineers know are optimistic and achieving things his critics know are real, still occupying more space in the global conversation than any private individual arguably should, and showing absolutely no signs of vacating it voluntarily. So this final chapter cannot be a verdict in the traditional sense, cannot be the clean summation that closes a life and draws a line under it, the way we could with Edison, who had the decency to complete his story before we tried to tell it. What it can be is something more honest and perhaps more useful, a serious attempt to reckon with what this man actually is, what he has actually done, and what it means, not as a myth, not as a meme, not as a villain or a savior, but as a human being operating at a scale and intensity that the world has rarely seen. Let's start with what is simply, inarguably true. Elon Musk has changed the world. Not metaphorically, not in the way that is said about people who made a popular app or disrupted a minor industry. Actually, physically, measurably changed the world in ways that affect millions of people and will continue to affect billions more. The electric vehicle transition, The thing that every major car manufacturer on Earth is now racing to complete would not be happening on its current timeline without Tesla. Full stop. The established automotive industry had the resources, the engineering capability, and the manufacturing infrastructure to build compelling electric vehicles for decades before Tesla existed. They chose not to, because the business model of selling combustion engines and the parts and fuel they require was profitable and familiar, and the incentive to disrupt it from within was essentially zero. Tesla disrupted it from outside, demonstrated that people would choose electric if electric was excellent, and forced the entire industry to respond. Every electric vehicle sold by every manufacturer carries, in some indirect but real sense, Tesla's fingerprint. The commercial space industry, the one that has driven launch costs down dramatically, that is building the infrastructure for permanent human presence beyond Earth, that has restored American crew launch capability and is developing vehicles capable of reaching the Moon and Mars, would not exist in its current form without SpaceX. NASA's model of cost-plus government contracting, under which aerospace giants built rockets slowly and expensively with little incentive for efficiency, was the only model available before SpaceX demonstrated that a different approach was possible. Every commercial launch company operating today, every government space agency rethinking its procurement model, every startup dreaming of space exists in a landscape that SpaceX fundamentally reshaped. These are not small things. These are generational things. Things that will still matter in 100 years, in ways that most of what dominates the news cycle today will not. And yet, the "and yet" is important. The "and yet" is where the honest accounting gets complicated and where the temptation, in both directions for both the devotees and the detractors, is to look away. Elon Musk has also been, at various points and in various ways, genuinely harmful. Not in the cartoonish supervillain sense that some of his critics prefer, but in the specific, documented, real-world sense that matters more. The workers at Tesla's factories have reported, in sufficient numbers and with sufficient consistency, across years and across facilities, conditions that fall short of what a person with his stated values about human potential should be willing to accept. Injury rates above industry averages, pressure to maintain production pace at the expense of safety, a union-busting posture that reflects not just a business preference, but a specific philosophy about the relationship between workers and owners that is worth examining honestly, rather than dismissing. The public cruelty, the tweets aimed at individuals, the mockery, the willingness to use a platform of hundreds of millions of followers to direct attention toward people who have neither the resources nor the reach to respond in kind, is real, and it is ugly. And it does not become less ugly because the target is sometimes someone who has behaved badly, or because the person doing it has also funded electric cars and rocket ships. The relationship with truth is complicated in ways that matter, the timelines that are announced and missed, the claims made about products and technologies that turn out to be more distant or more difficult than the announcement suggested, the SEC settlements over tweets that moved markets. These are not simply the inevitable friction of ambitious people attempting ambitious things. They represent a relationship with accuracy that is sometimes strategic rather than sincere, and the people harmed by that, investors who made decisions based on misleading information, employees who planned their lives around promises that weren't kept, are real people with real consequences. And the political chapter, still being written, still evolving, raises questions that are serious and not yet answerable. When the richest person in the world aligns himself explicitly with a political movement and uses his platform, his wealth, and his access to government processes in service of that alignment, the implications for democratic accountability are significant regardless of which side of the political divide you occupy. Power of that concentration, applied politically, is something that democratic systems were designed to check, and the mechanisms of that checking are being tested in ways that deserve attention from people of every political persuasion. So what do we do with all of this? How do we hold Edison's lesson that a complicated person can still illuminate the world, alongside the specific complications of this particular person at this particular moment? Perhaps the answer is to resist the temptation of a single verdict, to resist the pull toward either the hagiography that turns him into a flawless hero or the takedown that reduces him to a cautionary tale. Both are easier than the truth. Both are, in their different ways, a failure of seriousness. The serious thing is to look at what he has actually built and acknowledge it without flinching. Rockets that land, cars that changed an industry, satellites that connect the unconnected, a brain implant that gave a paralyzed person back a fragment of agency. These are real. They matter. A world without them is a worse world. And then to look at what he has actually cost. The workers, the relationships, the democratic norms, the people targeted from a platform he owns, and acknowledge that without flinching either. These are real too. They matter too. A full accounting cannot exclude them. The thing that Elon Musk most resembles, when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of him, is not a villain or a hero. He resembles a force that, like all forces, is neither good nor evil in itself but produces effects, some extraordinary, some destructive, depending on what it encounters and what direction it is pointing on any given day. Forces of this magnitude are rare. They appear in history at long intervals, attached to people who seem, in retrospect, almost implausibly concentrated. More energy, more will, more impact per unit of human lifetime than the surrounding environment can easily absorb. They change things. They always change things. The question history asks about them is not whether the change was comfortable or whether the person was likable. The question is whether the net direction of the change was towards something better. For Edison, despite his flaws and his failures and his ugly moments, the answer is clearly yes. The lights are still on, the music is still playing, the movies are still running. The world he helped build is, on balance, better than the world he found. For Musk, the answer is not yet available. The rockets are still flying, the cars are still on the roads, Mars is still in the future. The political chapter is still being written. The AI he fears and builds simultaneously has not yet shown its full hand. The story is open, unresolved, still accumulating consequences that will take decades to fully understand. What we can say, what the evidence of his life, examined honestly, compels us to say, is that he is the most consequential entrepreneur of his generation. That the scope of what he has attempted and achieved has no real parallel in the modern era. That the future, whatever it looks like, will bear his fingerprints in ways that are already visible and in ways that are not yet imaginable. We can also say that he is a man. A specific, complicated, brilliant, wounded, driven, sometimes magnificent, sometimes appalling man, made of the same material as the rest of us, operating under the same constraints of time and mortality and the fundamental unknowability of consequences, just doing it at a scale that makes the rest of us look on with a mixture of awe and alarm and the occasional desperate urge to tell him to put his phone down and get some sleep. He won't, of course. There are still problems to solve, still rockets to land, still a red planet hanging in the sky, waiting. The boy from Pretoria is still looking up, and the story, his story, our story, the one we are all living inside whether we chose to or not, is still being written. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you question, maybe even made you a little uncomfortable, then you are exactly the kind of person we make these for. Subscribe, and don't go far. Because the next giant is already waiting, and trust me, you do not want to miss it.